In the quaint village of St. Mary Mead, a sunlit fete hides a deadly secret. When Clara Henshaw, the village's baking queen, is found murdered, her prized recipe notebook vanishes. A rolling pin, a broken teacup, a mysterious alkaloid, and a muddy footprint led Miss Jane Marple, with her sharp eyes and quiet wisdom, into a web of envy, greed, and betrayal. Was it the rival baker, the ambitious businessman, the nervous maid, or the young grocer? In this classic whodunit, every clue bakes a truth that will shock the village. Can you unravel the recipe for murder before Miss Marple does? Chapter 1. The Village Fate. The sun hung high over St. Mary Mead, casting a golden glow across the vicarage lawn, where the annual fete unfolded in a cheerful bustle. Trestle tables groaned under the weight of homemade preserves, knitted tea cozies, and fragrant bouquets of lavender tied with ribbon. Children darted through the crowd, clutching sticky toffee apples, while the vicar, Reverend Clement, beamed benevolently from the bunting-draped podium. In her usual spot beneath a sprawling oak, Miss Jane Marple sat, her knitting needles clicking rhythmically, her mild blue eyes scanning the scene with the quiet alertness of a sparrow. The air carried the scent of freshly baked scones and the hum of village gossip. At the cake stall, Mrs. Clara Henshaw, St. Mary Mead's undisputed queen of pastry, presided with an air of serene authority. Her table boasted golden-crusted pies, featherlight sponges, and her famed almond tarts, each slice a testament to her culinary prowess. Yet, as Miss Marple observed, Clara's smile was tight, her movements sharp as she arranged her wares. In her hands, she clutched a small, leather-bound notebook, its edges worn from constant handling. Miss Marple knew it well. Clara's recipe book, a treasure she guarded with almost comical ferocity, never letting it leave her sight. A ripple of discord drew Miss Marple's attention. Near the stall, Clara was engaged in a heated exchange with Tom Breyer, the young assistant from the village grocer. Tom, a lanky lad with a mop of untidy hair, stood with his hands in his pockets, his face flushed. "I didn't touch your precious blend, Mrs. Henshaw," he protested, his voice carrying over the chatter. Clara's eyes flashed. "Don't lie to me, Tom Breyer. You've been snooping, and I'll not have it. Mark my words, you'll regret meddling." With that, she turned on her heel, her notebook tucked tightly under her arm, and strode toward the tea tent. Tom muttered something inaudible and slunk away, kicking at a tuft of grass. Miss Marple's needles paused, her mind filing away the incident. Clara's temper was rare but formidable, and Tom's sullen retreat suggested more than a passing quarrel. She noted, too, the curious glances from nearby villagers. Mrs. Lydia Price, Clara's baking rival, whose lips pursed disapprovingly, and Mr. Harold Finch, the sleek London businessman, who had recently taken up residence at Meadow House. Harold's eyes followed Clara with a calculating intensity, his manicured fingers adjusting his silk tie. Miss Marple recalled the rumour that he'd offered a small fortune for Clara's recipes, only to be rebuffed with her characteristic bluntness. As the afternoon wore on, the fete reached its crescendo. The vicar's wife, Mrs. Clement, bustled about, organising the raffle, while Ellen, Clara's young maid, hovered near the cake stall, her small frame nearly lost in the crowd. Miss Marple watched Ellen's nervous glances toward her employer, her hands twisting in her apron. Poor child, Miss Marple thought, always so anxious. The tombola spun. Prizes were claimed, and the village band struck up a jaunty tune. Yet, beneath the merriment, Miss Marple sensed an undercurrent, a tension she could not yet name. By dusk, the stalls were packed away, and the villagers drifted homeward, their laughter echoing down the lanes. Miss Marple, gathering her knitting, exchanged pleasantries with Mrs. Clement, who remarked on Clara's unusually sharp mood. "She's been clutching that notebook all day," Mrs. Clement confided. "I dare say it's worth its weight in gold." Miss Marple smiled, her thoughts elsewhere. Clara's notebook, she knew, was more than a collection of recipes. It was a symbol of her pride, perhaps even her power in St. Mary Mead. That night, as Miss Marple sipped her chamomile tea by her cottage fire, a knock at the door startled her. It was Mrs. Clement, her face pale. "Oh, Miss Marple, it's dreadful. Clara Henshaw's been found dead in her kitchen. Murdered, they say. Struck down with her own rolling pin." Miss Marple's cup paused at her lips. "And the notebook?" she asked quietly. Mrs. Clement shook her head. "Gone. Vanished." Miss Marple set her cup down, her mind already sifting through the day's observations. "A recipe worth killing for," she murmured, her eyes gleaming with purpose. "We shall see." Chapter 2. The scene of the crime. The morning after the fate dawned crisp and clear, with a mist lingering over the meadows of St. Mary Mead. Miss Jane Marple, wrapped in her woolen shawl, made her way along the cobbled lane to Clara Henshaw's cottage, her steps measured but purposeful. The village was already stirring with the news of Clara's murder, and whispers trailed her like leaves in the wind. At the cottage gate she paused, her sharp eyes taking in the scene, the neat flower beds, the ivy-clad walls, and the small crowd of onlookers kept at bay by Constable Reed, a young officer whose earnestness outstripped his experience. Miss Marple's lips curved faintly. She had known Reed since he was a boy, always diligent, but prone to missing the subtler threads of human nature. "Good morning, Constable," she greeted, her voice mild as she approached. Reed, his notebook in hand, looked up with a mix of respect and faint exasperation. "Miss Marple, you shouldn't be here. This is a crime scene, you know." She nodded, her knitting bag swinging gently at her side. "Of course, but I thought I might offer a little assistance. Clara was a friend after all." Reed hesitated, then stepped aside. Miss Marple's reputation for unravelling village mysteries was well known, and he knew better than to dismiss her outright. The cottage door stood ajar, revealing the kitchen where Clara had met her end. Miss Marple stepped inside, her senses alert to every detail. The room was a model of order, as Clara's kitchen always was. Copper pans gleamed on their hooks. A row of spice jars lined the shelf, and a faint scent of vanilla lingered in the air. Yet the scene was marred by signs of violence. On the tiled floor lay a heavy oak rolling pin, its polished surface unblemished save for a faint smear of blood. Nearby, a single teacup lay shattered, its delicate floral patterns scattered in fragments. The table held an open tin of Clara's almond tarts, untouched, and a dusting of flour coated the counter like a ghostly fingerprint. Miss Marple's eyes moved to a small locked cupboard above the stove, its brass keyhole gleaming. She had heard the village tales of Clara's ingredient vault, a repository for her most precious supplies, accessible only to her. Now the cupboard door was slightly ajar, its lock intact but unfastened. "Curious," she murmured, her needles clicking softly in her bag as she stepped closer. Constable Reed, scribbling notes, glanced up. "We've searched the place, Miss Marple. No sign of that notebook everyone's talking about. I reckon the killer took it." "Indeed," she replied, her tone neutral. "And what else did you find, Constable?" Reed gestured to the rolling pin. "That's the weapon, no doubt. Dr. Haydock says she was struck from behind, a single blow to the head. Died instantly, poor woman. No fingerprints on the pin, though. Wiped clean, I'd wager." Miss Marple nodded, her gaze lingering on the rolling pin's smooth handle. A killer careful enough to wipe it clean but careless enough to leave it behind. She filed the thought away. Her attention shifted to the back door, which opened onto a narrow path leading to the vicarage garden. There, in the soft earth just beyond the threshold, she spotted a faint footprint, small and delicate, with a distinctive tread. It was too small for a man's boot, and the pattern suggested a woman's shoe, perhaps one worn for gardening. She bent slightly, her shawl brushing the floor, and studied the mark. "Have you noted this, Constable?" she asked. Reed flushed, hurrying over. "Missed that, I'm afraid. Could be the maids. Ellen was in and out," she said. Miss Marple's smile was encouraging, but her mind was racing. Ellen's shoes were small, yes, but the mud was fresh, and the fate had been dry. Where had the mud come from? She turned to the cupboard, her fingers brushing its edge. Inside, she saw jars of spices: cardamom, nutmeg, saffron, arranged with Clara's meticulous care. But one jar stood out, labelled "Special Blend" in Clara's precise hand. It was nearly empty, containing only a pinch of fine white powder that bore little resemblance to flour. Miss Marple's brow furrowed. Clara's baking triumphs were legendary, but whispers of a secret ingredient had long circulated. Could this be it? She reached for a clean handkerchief from her bag, carefully collecting a small sample of the powder, folding it with the precision of a surgeon. "I shall ask Dr. Haydock to examine this," she said, more to herself than to Reed. As she surveyed the kitchen once more, her eyes caught a detail she had nearly overlooked: a single strand of dark thread caught on the edge of the table near the broken teacup. It was coarse, unlike Clara's fine linens, and its deep navy hue suggested a garment not typically worn in a kitchen. She plucked it gently, tucking it into her handkerchief alongside the powder. Small things tell large stories, she thought, her mind drifting to the suspects she had observed at the fete. Constable Reed, meanwhile, was recounting his findings with a touch of pride. "We've questioned Ellen, the maid. She says she left Clara here after the fete, alive and well, and went home. No one else was seen entering, but the back door was unlocked. Anyone could have slipped in." Miss Marple nodded, her expression attentive but non-committal. "And the notebook? You're certain it's gone?" Reed nodded vigorously. "Clara's recipe books are on that shelf there, but the little leather one she always carried. Nowhere to be found. I reckon it's the key to this whole business." Miss Marple's gaze lingered on the shelf. Clara's recipe books, neatly bound and labelled, stood untouched, their pages filled with standard fare: scones, fruitcakes, jams. But the leather notebook was different, a private compendium of Clara's genius, rumoured to contain not only her recipes, but the secret of her unmatched flavours. Its absence was telling, but so was the state of the kitchen. A struggle would have left more chaos: spilled flour, scattered utensils. Yet the room was nearly pristine. The killer had been careful, perhaps familiar with Clara's habits. Stepping outside, Miss Marple followed the path to the vicarage garden, where the earth was soft from recent watering. The footprints' trail faded quickly, but she noted its direction, toward the vicarage, where Ellen had been seen lingering at the fete. She made a mental note to speak with the girl, whose nervous demeanour had caught her eye. For now, she returned to the cottage, where Reed was sealing the door with official tape. "I'll be speaking to Tom Breyer next," he said. "That row with Clara at the fete, everyone heard it. He's got motive, if you ask me." "Perhaps," Miss Marple said, her tone gentle. "But motives are like recipes, Constable. The ingredients must be measured carefully, or the truth curdles." Reed blinked, unsure how to respond, and Miss Marple took her leave, her mind alight with possibilities. Back at her cottage, she settled into her armchair, her knitting in her lap, and let her thoughts unfold. Clara's death was no random act. The missing notebook pointed to a deliberate motive, but whose? Tom Breyer's argument suggested a personal grudge, perhaps over Clara's accusation of theft. Yet Tom, with his open face and clumsy manners, seemed an unlikely murderer. Mrs. Lydia Price, Clara's rival, had the ambition to steal a recipe, but would she kill for it? And Harold Finch, the London businessman, had the resources and the ruthlessness to act decisively, but his interest was commercial, not personal. Then there was Ellen, the quiet maid, whose small feet and nervous glances hinted at a secret. Miss Marple's fingers paused over her knitting as she considered the special blend. If it was no ordinary flour, what was it? A rare spice? An extract? She recalled Clara's almond tarts, their flavour hauntingly unique, almost addictive. The village had long speculated about Clara's methods, some whispering of exotic ingredients sourced from distant markets. Miss Marple resolved to send the powder to Dr. Haydock, whose scientific curiosity matched her own. A secret worth killing for, she mused, is rarely just about taste. As she sipped her tea, her thoughts returned to the footprint. The mud suggested a recent visit to the vicarage garden, but why? The fate had been held on dry ground, and Clara's cottage was self-contained, with no need for external errands. Ellen's explanation would need to be tested, but Miss Marple sensed the girl was hiding something, not malice perhaps, but fear. And the navy thread. It could belong to anyone, yet its presence in Clara's meticulous kitchen was an anomaly, a clue to an outsider's presence. She rose, tucking her handkerchief into her bag, and made her way to Dr. Haydock's surgery, a short walk through the village. The doctor, a gruff but kindly man, greeted her with a raised eyebrow. "Jane Marple, poking about in murders again. What's this you've brought me?" She handed him the handkerchief, explaining the powder's origin. "I'd be grateful if you could tell me what it is, doctor. It may be nothing, but Clara was particular about her ingredients." Haydock promised to analyse it. His interest piqued. "If it's one of Clara's tricks, it'll be a devil to identify." She was cleverer than most gave her credit for. Returning home, Miss Marple passed the village shop, where Tom Breyer was stacking crates. His shoulders were hunched, his expression troubled. She paused, offering a gentle smile. "A sad business about Clara, Tom. You must be shaken." He nodded, avoiding her eyes. "She thought I stole her flour, Miss Marple, but I swear I didn't. I'd never harm her." His sincerity was convincing, but Miss Marple noted the sweat on his brow. "Of course, Tom," she said kindly. "Truth has a way of rising, like good dough." He managed a weak smile, but she saw the fear in his eyes. As she walked on, her mind pieced together the morning's observations. The clean rolling pin, the broken teacup, the footprint, the thread, the missing notebook. All were fragments of a larger pattern. Clara's death was no impulsive act. It was calculated, driven by a desire for her secrets. But whose desire? And why leave the rolling pin behind? Miss Marple's needles resumed their rhythm, her thoughts as precise as her stitches. People are so careless, she thought, even when they think they've covered their tracks. By evening, the village was quiet, but Miss Marple's mind was far from still. She sat by her fire, her knitting a pretext for reflection. The notebook's theft suggested a motive rooted in Clara's baking, but the alkaloid, if that's what it was, hinted at a deeper secret, one that might extend beyond St. Mary Mead. She recalled Harold Finch's sleek confidence, Lydia Price's bitter rivalry, and Ellen's trembling hands. Each had a part to play, but the truth lay in the details, the small, overlooked details that only someone like Miss Marple would notice. As the clock struck 9, she set her knitting aside, her resolve firm. Clara Henshaw's murder was a puzzle, and Miss Marple was determined to solve it. "A recipe for murder," she murmured, "requires more than flour and sugar. It requires greed, fear, and a touch of desperation." With that, she extinguished her lamp, her mind already turning to the next day's inquiries. Chapter 3. The suspects gather. The sun had barely crested the spire of St. Mary Mead's church when the village began to hum with the aftershock of Clara Henshaw's murder. By midday, The vicarage drawing room was a hive of subdued voices and clinking teacups, as the vicar's wife, Mrs. Clement, had invited a small group to discuss the tragedy under the guise of condolence. Miss Jane Marple, seated in a chintz-covered armchair, her knitting bag at her feet, observed the gathering with her usual quiet acuity. Her mild blue eyes, deceptively soft, darted from face to face, noting every gesture, every inflection, as if the room were a stage and the players unaware of their roles. Mrs. Clement, her plump cheeks flushed with the strain of hospitality, poured tea from a silver pot, her chatter a nervous counterpoint to the room's tension. "Such a dreadful thing," she said, passing a cup to Mrs. Lydia Price, whose thin lips tightened at the mention of Clara's name. Lydia, a wiry woman in her 50s, was known for her scones, which, though respectable, had never rivaled Clara's ethereal lightness. Her black dress was impeccable, but Miss Marple noted the pristine handkerchief, clutched in her hand, untouched by tears despite her reddened eyes. Grief, or a careful performance? Miss Marple's needles clicked softly, her thoughts concealed behind a placid smile. Across the room, Tom Briar slouched in a chair, his lanky frame ill at ease in the vicarage's formal setting. His cap, twisted in his hands, bore the stains of his grocer's work, and his eyes flickered nervously toward the door, as if he longed to escape. Miss Marple recalled his altercation with Clara at the fete, the accusation of theft that had left him sullen. His presence here, she suspected, was less out of respect for Clara than a desire to gauge the village's suspicions. Mr. Harold Finch, the London businessman, stood by the window, his tailored suit a stark contrast to the village's homespun simplicity. His sharp features and restless fingers suggested a man accustomed to boardrooms, not tea parties. Miss Marple had heard of his failed attempt to buy Clara's recipes, a rebuff that had stung his pride. Now, his gaze swept the room with a detached air, but she caught the fleeting intensity in his eyes when Clara's name was mentioned. A man like Harold Finch, she thought, did not take rejection lightly. Hovering near the tea tray was Ellen, Clara's maid, her small hands smoothing her apron with a nervous rhythm. Her pale face and downcast eyes made her nearly invisible, yet Miss Marple noted her proximity to the conversation, her ears straining to catch every word. Ellen's small, delicate shoes that matched the muddy footprint at Clara's cottage, were polished now, but Miss Marple's mind lingered on that detail. The girl's timidity masked something deeper, perhaps fear, perhaps guilt. Mrs. Clement, ever the dutiful hostess, pressed a plate of biscuits on her guests, her voice bright with forced cheer. We must remember Clara's kindness, her talent. Why, her almond tarts were the talk of the county. The remark drew varied responses. Lydia's mouth twitched, as if suppressing a retort. Tom shifted uncomfortably, his cap crumpling further. Harold gave a dismissive snort, muttering, "Provincial nonsense!" And Ellen's hands froze on her apron, her eyes darting to the floor. Miss Marple sipped her tea, her mind cataloguing each reaction. The conversation turned, as it inevitably must, to the murder. Mrs. Clement, lowering her voice, shared what little she knew. Constable Reed says it was a single blow, quite deliberate. And that notebook of hers, gone. I always said it was her treasure. Lydia leaned forward, her voice sharp. Treasure indeed. Clara was no saint, you know. She had her secrets, and that notebook held them. I wouldn't be surprised if her special ingredient was something unnatural, perhaps even illegal. Her words hung in the air, heavy with implication. Miss Marple's needles paused, her eyes resting on Lydia's flushed cheeks. Envy, she thought, could curdle even the sweetest disposition. Tom, roused from his silence, spoke up, his voice defensive. She thought I was after her flower blend, but I wasn't. I only delivered her orders, same as always. She was wrong to accuse me. His words were earnest, but Miss Marple noted the sweat on his brow, the way his fingers tightened on his cap. A young man with a grudge, perhaps, but a killer? She doubted it, yet his unease suggested he knew more than he admitted. Harold Finch, turning from the window, waved a hand dismissively. All this fuss over a recipe book. Clara was a fine baker, but her refusal to share her work was foolish. In London, we'd have turned her tarts into a fortune. His tone was smooth, but Miss Marple caught the edge of frustration beneath it. A man like Finch, she mused, saw everything in terms of profit, and Clara's defiance had cost him dearly. Ellen, silent until now, murmured, "Mrs. Henshaw was good to me. She didn't deserve this." Her voice was barely audible, but Miss Marple saw the tremor in her hands, the way her eyes flicked toward the vicarage garden beyond the window. The garden, where the muddy path led from Clara's cottage. Miss Marple made a mental note to explore that connection further. As the tea grew cold, the conversation faltered, each guest retreating into their thoughts. Mrs. Clement, sensing the mood, bustled about with fresh cups, but Miss Marple's attention remained on the suspects. Lydia's bitterness, Tom's defensiveness, Harold's ambition, Ellen's fear. Each was a thread in the tapestry of Clara's murder, but the pattern was not yet clear. She recalled the navy thread found in Clara's kitchen, the footprint, the missing notebook. Small clues, but in St. Mary Mead, small clues often told the largest stories. Rising to leave, Miss Marple thanked Mrs. Clement with her usual courtesy, her knitting bag tucked under her arm. As she stepped into the vicarage garden, she paused, her eyes scanning the soft earth. There, near the path to Clara's cottage, she saw faint traces of mud, disturbed by recent footsteps. The pattern was familiar, matching the print at the crime scene. She glanced back at the vicarage, where Ellen was clearing the tea tray, her movements quick and furtive. People reveal themselves in small ways, Miss Marple thought, her mind turning to the next steps in her inquiry. As she walked home, the village settling into its afternoon quiet, Miss Marple's thoughts were far from idle. Clara's notebook was the key, but its value lay not in recipes alone. The special ingredient Lydia had hinted at, the alkaloid Dr. Haydock was analysing, those were the heart of the mystery. And the suspects, gathered so conveniently today, had each shown a glimpse of their motives. Lydia's rivalry, Tom's fear, Harold's greed, Ellen's secrecy. Each was a piece of the puzzle, but the truth lay in how they fit together. Miss Marple's needles resumed their rhythm, her mind as sharp as the steel in her hands. "A murder," she murmured, "is like a recipe. The ingredients must be just right, or the whole thing falls apart." Chapter 4. A Clue in the Flower. Miss Jane Marple sat by her cottage window, the morning light filtering through lace curtains, her knitting a soft counterpoint to the whirl of her thoughts. The village of St. Mary Mead was subdued, the shock of Clara Henshaw's murder settling like dust after a storm. Miss Marple's visit to Clara's cottage the previous day had left her with fragments of a puzzle: the wiped clean rolling pin, the broken teacup, the navy thread, the muddy footprint, and the near-empty jar of special blend. These were not mere trifles, she knew, but signposts to a killer's intent. Her task now was to follow them, step by careful step, in the manner of a recipe meticulously measured. After breakfast, she donned her tweed coat and made her way back to Clara's cottage, where Constable Reed, ever dutiful, was re-examining the scene under the watchful eye of a few curious villagers. His face brightened at her approach, though he tried to mask it with official sternness. "Miss Marple, you're back. I suppose you've a theory or two." She smiled, her eyes twinkling with the modesty that disarmed so many. "Only a few questions, Constable. May I take another look?" Reed, unable to resist her gentle persistence, waved her inside. The kitchen was as she remembered, orderly, almost serene, save for the traces of violence. The rolling pin had been removed for evidence, but the broken teacup's shards remained, glinting on the floor. Miss Marple's gaze returned to the cupboard above the stove, its door now fully open, revealing a disarray of jars and tins. Clara's ingredient vault had been rifled, though whether by the killer or an overzealous constable, she could not yet say. She stepped closer, her fingers brushing the jar labelled "Special Blend." Its contents, a scant pinch of fine white powder, were unchanged, but she noted a faint smudge on the glass, as if someone had handled it carelessly. "Constable," she said, her voice soft, "have you examined this jar closely?" Reed shook his head, his attention elsewhere. "Just flour, I reckon." The killer was after the notebook, not her spices. Miss Marple's lips curved faintly. "Perhaps," she said, but her mind was elsewhere. She recalled the handkerchief in her bag, containing the powder she'd collected yesterday. Dr. Hayduck would have results soon, but for now, she needed more context. "Was the cupboard locked when you first arrived?" she asked. Reed nodded. "Forced open, though. No key found." She turned her attention to the shelf of recipe books, their spines worn but intact. Clara's public recipes, her scones, her fruitcakes, were meticulously recorded here, but the leather notebook, her private trove, was still missing. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. The notebooks. Theft suggested a motive tied to Clara's culinary secrets, but the forced cupboard hinted at something more specific, a search for the special blend itself. She made a mental note to inquire about Clara's suppliers, perhaps through Tom Breyer, who handled her deliveries. Leaving the cottage, Miss Marple walked to the village surgery, where Dr. Hayduck was expecting her. The doctor, a robust man with a penchant for plain speaking, greeted her with a wry smile. "Jane Marple, sniffing out trouble again. That powder you brought me, it's a curious thing." He led her to his small laboratory, where a microscope and a clutter of vials spoke of his scientific zeal. "It's not flour," he said, adjusting his spectacles. "It's laced with an alkaloid. Rare but not toxic. I'd wager it's derived from a plant. Something exotic. Gives a subtle flavour enhancement, almost addictive in its effect. Clara was clever, using it to make her baking stand out." Miss Marple's eyes gleamed. "Not illegal, then?" Haydock shook his head. "No, but unusual. Hard to source, too. She must have had a supplier, someone discreet." Miss Marple nodded, tucking the information away. The alkaloid explained Clara's edge over rivals like Lydia Price, but it also deepened the mystery. Was the notebook stolen for the alkaloid's source? And why kill Clara to get it? Her next stop was Clara's cottage again, this time to speak with Ellen, who was tidying the front garden under Constable Reed's supervision. The maid's small frame was bent over a rose bush, her hands trembling slightly. Miss Marple approached with her usual kindness, her voice as soothing as a lullaby. "Ellen, my dear, you must be dreadfully upset. Clara was fond of you, wasn't she?" Ellen's eyes, wide and wary, met hers briefly before dropping. "She was good to me, Miss Marple. Strict, but fair." Miss Marple settled on a garden bench, her knitting bag at her side. "I understand you cleaned her kitchen daily. Did you ever see that notebook of hers?" Ellen's hands stilled, her face paling. "She kept it locked in the cupboard, miss. Never let me near it. But lately, she was nervous, always checking it, like she thought someone was after it." Miss Marple's needles clicked softly, her tone unchanged. "And the night of the fete? You left her at the cottage, I believe." Ellen nodded quickly. "Yes, miss. She was fine when I left. I went straight home." Miss Marple's eyes flicked to Ellen's shoes, small and neatly polished, but her mind was on the muddy footprint by the back door. "You didn't step out to the garden, perhaps? To fetch something?" Ellen's cheeks flushed, and she shook her head vehemently. "No, miss. The woodpile's indoors, and I didn't need anything else. Miss Marple smiled, her expression gentle but her thoughts sharp. The lie was small but telling. Ellen's shoes matched the footprint, and the mud suggested a connection to the vicarage garden. Why would she conceal a simple errand? As she rose to leave, Miss Marple paused, her gaze lingering on the garden path. A faint trace of mud, now dry, marked the route to the vicarage. She filed the observation away, her mind turning to the other suspects. Lydia Price's bitterness at the vicarage tea had been palpable. Her insinuations about Clara's unnatural ingredient laced with envy. Harold Finch's commercial ambitions were equally suspect, his London patisserie chain teetering on the edge of ruin. And Tom Breyer, though seemingly guileless, had been accused by Clara of theft, a charge that might hide a deeper grievance. Back at her cottage, Miss Marple sat by her fire, her knitting a pretext for reflection. The alkaloid was the key, she felt certain. Its presence in the special blend explained Clara's dominance, but its rarity suggested a secret worth protecting or stealing. The notebook, she suspected, held not just recipes, but the name of Clara's supplier, a detail that could ruin reputations or reap fortunes. Lydia might have coveted it to surpass her rival, Harold to save his business, Tom to cover some youthful indiscretion, and Ellen. Her nervousness suggested involvement, but Miss Marple sensed it was not malice, but fear that drove her. She recalled the navy thread from the kitchen table, its coarse texture unlike Clara's fine linens. It could belong to a coat, perhaps, or a scarf, something worn by a visitor. Lydia favoured sombre colours, but so did half the village. Harold's tailored suits were too fine for such a thread, and Tom's work clothes were stained with flour and grease. Ellen, however, often wore a navy apron, though Miss Marple had not seen it at the fete. Another thread to tug, she thought. As evening fell, Miss Marple penned a note to her nephew, Raymond West, asking him to inquire about Harold Finch's London dealings. If Clara's recipes were as valuable as rumoured, Harold's desperation might have pushed him to extremes. She also resolved to visit the village shop, where Tom worked, to probe his story further. The alkaloid, the footprint, the thread, the notebook, all were ingredients in a recipe for murder, and Miss Marple was determined to uncover the method behind it. She set her knitting aside, her mind alight with possibilities. People think they can hide their secrets, she murmured, but they leave traces, like crumbs on a tablecloth. With that, she extinguished her lamp, her thoughts already turning to the next day's inquiries. Chapter 5. The London Connection. The morning mist clung to the hedgerows of St. Mary Mead as Miss Jane Marple sat at her writing desk, her pen poised over a letter from her nephew, Raymond West. His reply, delivered by the early post, was characteristically brisk but informative, detailing what he had uncovered about Harold Finch's affairs in London. Miss Marple's eyes, sharp behind her spectacles, scanned the lines with quiet intensity. Her knitting lay idle in its basket, for her mind was wholly occupied with the threads of Clara Henshaw's murder, threads that now stretched beyond the village to the bustling streets of the capital. Raymond's letter confirmed what Miss Marple had suspected. Harold Finch's patisserie chain, Finch's finest, was teetering on the brink of financial ruin. Once a darling of London's elite, the chain had suffered from inconsistent quality and fierce competition. Harold had staked his reputation on a bold expansion, but without a unique offering, his investors were growing restless. "He's been sniffing about for something to set him apart," Raymond wrote, "and I hear he was furious when Clara Henshaw refused to sell her recipes. Word is, he saw her almond tarts as his salvation, a rustic gimmick to revive his brand." Miss Marple's lips pursed. Harold's ambition was clear, but would he kill to secure it? Setting the letter aside, she donned her hat and shawl and made her way to the village square, where the daily rhythm of St. Mary Mead carried on despite its recent tragedy. The postmistress, Mrs. Weatherby, was a reliable source of village intelligence, her counter a crossroads for gossip. Miss Marple greeted her with a smile, inquiring about recent deliveries to Clara's cottage. "Oh, she had letters from London, regular as clockwork," Mrs. Weatherby said, her eyes gleaming with the thrill of revelation. "Fancy envelopes too, with a gold seal. Finch's finest, it said. Came every week for a month, then stopped just before the fete." Miss Marple nodded, her mind filing away the detail. Harold's persistence suggested more than a passing interest in Clara's recipes. Had his offers turned to threats? She thanked Mrs. Weatherby and continued to the village pub, where she knew Harold often lingered in the evenings, his polished exterior at odds with the rustic setting. The Blue Boar was quiet at this hour, its oak beams and polished bar exuding a cosy warmth. Harold sat alone at a corner table, a glass of whiskey before him, his usual confidence dimmed by a scowl. "Good afternoon, Mr. Finch," Miss Marple said, settling nearby with her knitting. He started, his sharp eyes narrowing. "Miss Marple, isn't it? I'm not much for village chit-chat, I'm afraid." His tone was curt, but she smiled serenely. "Nor am I, when there's a murder to consider. Clara's death must be a shock, especially after your interest in her work." Harold's fingers tightened on his glass. "Her work was exceptional, I'll grant you. But she was stubborn, wouldn't see sense. I offered her a fortune, you know." Miss Marple's needles clicked rhythmically. "A fortune can tempt many, but not Clara. Did her refusal anger you?" Harold's laugh was harsh. "Anger? I'm a businessman, not a thug. Her loss, not mine. I'll find another way to turn a profit." Yet his eyes betrayed a flicker of unease, and Miss Marple noted the restless drumming of his fingers. A man under pressure, she thought, might act rashly, even if he cloaked it in sophistication. As she left the pub, her thoughts turned to Tom Breyer. The young grocer's assistant had been accused by Clara of tampering with her flour blend, a charge that lingered in Miss Marple's mind. She found him at the village shop, stacking sacks of flour with a distracted air. "Tom," she said gently, "you're looking troubled. Clara's accusations must weigh heavily." He flushed, his hands pausing. "She was wrong about me, Miss Marple. I never stole her blend. I might have mentioned to a baker in Chipping Norton that her flour came special from a London supplier. Clara overheard and thought I was selling her secrets." Miss Marple's eyes softened, but her mind was alert. "A London supplier, you say? Did you know the name?" Tom shook his head. "She never told me, only that it came in plain packages, no labels. She was particular about it." Miss Marple nodded, her thoughts circling back to Harold Finch. A London supplier could link Clara's special blend to Harold's ambitions, but the connection was still tenuous. Tom's candour seemed genuine, yet his fear suggested he was holding something back, perhaps a detail he thought inconsequential. Returning home, Miss Marple reflected on the alkaloid Dr. Haydock had identified. Its rarity pointed to a specialised source, likely urban, and Harold's letters to Clara suggested he knew more than he admitted. She recalled the navy thread from the kitchen, its coarse texture unlike anything in Clara's cottage. Could it belong to one of Harold's tailored coats, perhaps snagged during a clandestine visit? Or was it Ellen's apron, so often navy, though not worn at the fete? Lydia Price, too, favoured dark colours, her envy of Clara a potent motive. The threads of the case were tangling, but Miss Marple knew patience would unravel them. She sat by her fire, her knitting resuming its steady rhythm. The notebook's theft was no afterthought. It was the killer's prize, but why? If it held the alkaloid source, it could ruin reputations or reap rewards. Harold's failing business made him a likely candidate, but Lydia's rivalry and Ellen's secrecy could not be dismissed. And Tom, though unlikely a murderer, knew more than he said. "People are so careless with their secrets," Miss Marple murmured, "but they cannot hide them forever." As dusk settled over St. Mary Mead, she resolved to probe deeper into Harold's dealings and Tom's slip about the supplier. The alkaloid, the notebook, the thread, each was a clue, and Miss Marple was determined to follow them to the truth. A murder, she thought, is like a cake. The layers must be peeled back carefully, or the whole thing collapses. Chapter 6. The Maid's Secret. The soft glow of morning light filtered through the lace curtains of Miss Jane Marple's cottage, casting delicate patterns on the polished oak floor. She sat at her small breakfast table, a cup of tea steaming gently, her knitting resting beside a notepad where she had jotted her thoughts on Clara Henshaw's murder. The pieces of the puzzle, the alkaloid in the special blend, the missing notebook, the navy thread, the muddy footprint, were beginning to form a shape in her mind, though the edges remained elusive. Today, she resolved to focus on Ellen, Clara's maid, whose nervous demeanour and small telltale shoes suggested a secret too heavy for her slight frame to bear. Miss Marple donned her familiar tweed coat and straw hat, her knitting bag slung over her arm, and set out for the vicarage, where Ellen often helped Mrs. Clement with minor chores. The village of St. Mary Mead was stirring, its lanes alive with the clatter of milk bottles and the chatter of early risers, but an undercurrent of unease lingered, as if Clara's death had cast a shadow over the usual cheer. Miss Marple's steps were unhurried, her eyes scanning the familiar paths with the alertness of a hawk. At the vicarage, Mrs. Clement greeted her warmly, though her eyes betrayed the strain of recent events. "Oh, Miss Marple, it's good of you to come. Ellen's in the kitchen, polishing silver. Poor girl, she's been so quiet since Clara's passing." Miss Marple nodded, her smile sympathetic, but her mind sharp. "I thought a little chat might cheer her," she said, following Mrs. Clement to the kitchen. Ellen stood at a long oak table, her small hands working a cloth over a silver teapot with mechanical precision. Her pale face, framed by a neat cap, was drawn, and her eyes darted nervously as Miss Marple entered. "Good morning, Ellen," Miss Marple said, settling into a chair with her knitting. "I hope you don't mind my joining you. Polishing silver is such soothing work, don't you think?" Ellen managed a faint nod, her fingers tightening on the cloth. Miss Marple's needles began their gentle rhythm, a sound as disarming as her tone. "You must miss Clara terribly," she began, her voice soft as a summer breeze. "She relied on you, I'm sure." Ellen's eyes flickered, but she kept her gaze on the teapot. "She was good to me, miss. Always fair, though she could be particular about her kitchen." Miss Marple nodded, her eyes never leaving the girl's face. "And her notebook? She was particular about that too, wasn't she?" Ellen's hands paused, the cloth trembling slightly. "Yes, miss. She kept it locked in the cupboard above the stove. Never let me touch it." Miss Marple tilted her head, her expression one of kindly interest. "But you saw it, didn't you? Perhaps the night of the fete, when you left her at the cottage." Ellen's cheeks flushed, and she resumed polishing with renewed vigour. I saw her put it away before I left, miss. She was alive, I swear. It." Miss Marple's needles clicked steadily, her voice unchanged. "Of course, my dear. But I wonder, did you hear anything that night? Clara had been arguing, hadn't she? With Mrs. Price, perhaps?" Ellen's eyes widened, and she hesitated before speaking. "I heard them a few weeks back, miss, at the cottage. Mrs. Price came by, all in a huff, saying Clara's baking wasn't fair, that her special ingredient was cheating. Clara told her to mind her own business, but Mrs. Price said she'd tell everyone at the next county fair." Miss Marple's mind seized on the detail. Lydia's accusation aligned with her bitter remarks at the vicarage tea, but it also suggested a deeper motive, envy laced with a desire to expose Clara's secret. "That must have upset Clara," she said gently. Ellen nodded, her voice barely a whisper. "She was angry, miss, but scared, too. She started checking that notebook every day like she thought someone would take it. The conversation paused as Mrs. Clement bustled in with a tray of biscuits, her chatter filling the silence. Miss Marple took the opportunity to study Ellen's hands, noting their delicate size and the faint tremble that betrayed her nerves. She recalled the muddy footprint by Clara's back door, its small tread a match for Ellen's shoes. "You didn't step outside that night, did you, Ellen?" she asked, her tone as casual as if inquiring about the weather. "Perhaps to the vicarage garden." Ellen's face paled, and the teapot slipped slightly in her hands. "No, miss," she stammered. "I went straight home after leaving Mrs. Henshaw. The woodpile's indoors, and I didn't need to go anywhere else." Miss Marple's smile was kind, but her eyes were sharp. The lie was subtle, but unmistakable. The mud on the footprint had come from the vicarage garden, watered that day by Mrs. Clement's gardener, and Ellen's denial only deepened the mystery. As she rose to leave, Miss Marple thanked Ellen and Mrs. Clement, her mind racing. Ellen's knowledge of Lydia's argument was significant, but her evasiveness about the footprint suggested she was hiding something. Perhaps not the murder itself, but an act tied to it. Had she seen the killer? Or had she tampered with the scene to protect Clara's legacy? The notebook, Miss Marple felt certain, was at the heart of it, its contents more valuable than mere recipes. Outside, she paused by the vicarage garden, where the soft earth bore faint traces of footsteps leading toward Clara's cottage. The path was well trodden, but the mud matched the footprint's texture, confirming her suspicion. Ellen had been there, despite her denial, and Miss Marple resolved to uncover why. She recalled the navy thread from Clara's kitchen, its coarse weave unlike Ellen's apron, but possibly linked to another suspect. Lydia, perhaps, whose dark shawl had caught her eye at the tea. Returning home, Miss Marple sat by her fire, her knitting a pretext for reflection. Ellen's fear suggested she was protecting someone, or something, perhaps the notebook itself. Lydia's confrontation with Clara pointed to a motive rooted in rivalry, but Harold Finch's desperation and Tom Brier's unease could not be dismissed. The alkaloid, identified by Dr. Haydock as a flavour enhancer, was the key, and Miss Marple suspected the notebook held the name of its source, a secret worth killing for. She penned a note to Dr. Haydock, asking if he could trace the alkaloid's origin, perhaps through his contacts in London. She also decided to revisit Tom Brier, whose mention of a London supplier hinted at a connection to Harold Finch. The threads of the case were weaving together, but the pattern was not yet clear. "People think they can bury their secrets," Miss Marple murmured, "but they always leave a trail, like flour on a baker's hands." As evening fell, she set her knitting aside, her resolve firm. Tomorrow, she would press Ellen further and probe Tom's story, all while keeping an eye on Lydia and Harold. The truth, she knew, lay in the small details, the footprint, the thread, the lie, and Miss Marple was determined to uncover it. Chapter 7. The recipe revealed. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the lawns of St. Mary Mead, bathing the village in a golden haze that belied the grim undercurrent of Clara Henshaw's murder. Miss Jane Marple sat in her cottage, her knitting needles idle for once, as she pored over a note from Dr. Haydock, delivered by the morning post. His final analysis of the special blend had arrived, and its contents were as illuminating as she had hoped. The alkaloid, he confirmed, was a rare extract from a South American plant, harmless in small doses, but capable of imparting a subtle, almost addictive flavour to baked goods. Clara's secret, he wrote, was her genius in sourcing it. "I've traced it to a botanical supplier in London, but the name eludes me. I'll need more time." Miss Marple's eyes gleamed behind her spectacles. The alkaloid was the heart of Clara's baking triumphs, and the notebook, she now felt certain, contained the name of this elusive supplier. a secret that could ruin reputations or reap fortunes. Her mind turned to the suspects: Lydia Price's envy, Harold Finch's ambition, Tom Breyer's unease, and Ellen's secretive fear. Each had a motive, but the clues, the navy thread, the muddy footprint, the broken teacup, pointed to a truth hidden in plain sight. Determined to draw the suspects out, Miss Marple proposed a memorial tea at the vicarage, ostensibly to honour Clara, but cunningly designed to observe their reactions. Mrs. Clement, ever eager to soothe the village's nerves, agreed readily, and by 4 o'clock, the vicarage drawing-room was filled with the soft clink of china and the murmur of voices. The guests included the key players: Lydia, her thin face set in a mask of mournful propriety; Harold, his sleek suit at odds with the rustic setting; Tom, fidgeting with his tie as if it were a noose; and Ellen, hovering near the tea tray, her small hands twisting in her apron. Mrs. Clement, bustling with hospitality, poured tea and offered Clara's own almond tarts, baked from a recipe shared with the vicar's wife before her death. "A fitting tribute," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. Miss Marple, seated in her usual armchair, her knitting bag at her feet, watched the room with the quiet intensity of a chess master. The tarts, though delicious, lacked the haunting quality of Clara's originals, a fact not lost on Lydia, whose lips curled slightly as she nibbled one. "Not quite the same, are they?" she remarked, her tone laced with satisfaction. Miss Marple's needles clicked softly, her mind noting the barb. As the conversation turned to Clara's legacy, Miss Marple seized her moment. "It's remarkable, isn't it?" she said, her voice mild. "How Clara's baking captivated us all. That notebook of hers must have held such treasures." The room stilled, and she continued, her eyes sweeping over the suspects. "But it wasn't just recipes, I think. It held the secret of her special blend. An alkaloid, Dr. Haydock tells me, from a rare plant. A secret someone was desperate to possess." Harold's teacup paused at his lips, his sharp eyes narrowing. "An alkaloid? Sounds like nonsense to me. Clara was just a good baker, nothing more." His tone was dismissive, but Miss Marple caught the tension in his jaw. Lydia's face flushed, her voice sharp. "I knew it. She was cheating, using some trick to win every competition. That's no honest baking." Tom shifted uncomfortably, his eyes on the floor, while Ellen's hands froze, her face paling as if struck. Miss Marple's needles continued their rhythm, her mind cataloguing each reaction. "Desperate enough to kill, perhaps," Miss Marple continued, her tone as gentle as if discussing the weather. "The notebook was taken after all, and the cupboard forced open. Someone wanted that secret, but they left traces." She paused, her eyes resting on Ellen. "Ellen, my dear, you were at the cottage that night, weren't you? Your footprint was by the back door, in mud from the vicarage garden." The room froze, all eyes on the maid, who gasped, her hands clutching the tray. I didn't kill her, miss," she cried, tears welling. "I swear it." Miss Marple's voice remained kind, but her gaze was unwavering. "I believe you, Ellen, but you took the notebook, didn't you? Not to steal, but to protect Clara's reputation." Ellen's sobs broke the silence, and she nodded, her voice barely audible. "I found her dead, miss, the notebook open on the counter. I knew about the special powder. She'd told me it was her secret, but nothing bad. I was afraid people would think ill of her, call her a cheat. So I took it, hid it in the vicarage garden, meaning to burn it later. But I didn't touch her, I swear." The room erupted in murmurs, but Miss Marple's attention shifted to the others. Harold's face was impassive, but his fingers drummed a nervous rhythm. Tom looked stunned, his mouth agape, while Lydia's eyes burned with a mix of triumph and fear. Miss Marple's mind raced, the pieces falling into place. Ellen's confession explained the footprint and the notebook's disappearance, but not the murder itself. The navy thread, the broken teacup, those pointed elsewhere. Ellen's act was one of loyalty, Miss Marple said, her voice cutting through the murmurs. But the killer wanted the notebook for gain, not protection. Someone who knew its value, who couldn't bear Clara's refusal to share it. Her eyes lingered on Lydia, whose handkerchief was now crumpled in her fist. Mrs. Price, you argued with Clara about her methods, didn't you? You believed her success was unfair. Lydia's face tightened, her voice shrill. I only said what everyone thought. She was no saint using tricks to win. But I didn't kill her. Miss Marple's smile was serene, but her words were precise. Perhaps not, but the teacup in her kitchen, broken in the struggle, it had a trace of your rose lipstick, Mrs. Price. A small thing, but telling. Lydia's gasp was audible, her face draining of colour. The room fell silent, the weight of the accusation hanging heavy. Miss Marple's needles paused, her eyes soft but unrelenting. You wanted her secret, didn't you? To prove you were the better baker, to claim her crown. Lydia's hands trembled, her voice a whisper. You've no proof, she said, but the defiance was hollow. Miss Marple's mind was clear now, the pattern complete. The truth was close, but one final piece remained. The killer's confession, drawn out by the pressure of her gentle, inexorable logic. As the tea grew cold, Miss Marple sat back, her knitting resumed, her thoughts as sharp as ever. Secrets, she murmured to herself, are like ingredients. They must be handled with care, or they spoil everything. Chapter 8. The Killer, Unmasked. The vicarage drawing-room was hushed, the air thick with anticipation as Miss Jane Marple's gentle voice carried the weight of her accusations. The memorial tea, arranged with Mrs. Clement's unwitting cooperation, had become the stage for a reckoning. The suspects, Lydia Price, Harold Finch, Tom Briar, and Ellen, sat rigid, their faces a gallery of emotions, defiance, unease, confusion, and fear. Miss Marple, her knitting needle silent in her lap, surveyed them with her bird-like eyes, her serene demeanour masking the precision of her logic. The clues, the alkaloid, the navy thread, the muddy footprint, the broken teacup, had woven a tapestry, and now she was ready to reveal its final pattern. Mrs. Clement, sensing the tension, hovered near the tea tray, her usual chatter stilled. The almond tarts, a pale imitation of Clara's, sat untouched, their presence a silent tribute to the woman whose death had brought them here. Miss Marple's gaze settled on Lydia Price, whose thin hands clutched her handkerchief like a lifeline. Mrs. Price, she said, her tone as mild as if discussing a recipe. You were so certain Clara's success was unfair. You confronted her, didn't you? Not just weeks ago, as Ellen overheard, but on the night of the fete. Lydia's eyes flashed, her voice sharp but unsteady. I've told you, Miss Marple. I said what needed saying. Clara was no honest baker, using that trick of hers to win every prize. But I didn't kill her. Her words were defiant, yet her face betrayed a flicker of panic, her lips trembling as they had not during her earlier displays of grief. Miss Marple's smile was gentle, but her eyes were unrelenting. Perhaps you didn't mean to, she said softly. But the teacup in Clara's kitchen, broken in a struggle, it bore a trace of your rose lipstick, a shade you favour. A small thing, but it places you there. The room gasped, Mrs. Clement's hand flying to her mouth, Lydia's face drained of colour, her handkerchief falling to the floor. You've no proof, she cried. But her voice cracked, and Miss Marple pressed on, her tone unchanged. You went to Clara's cottage after the fete, didn't you? You demanded the secret of her special blend, the alkaloid that made her baking unmatched. When she refused, perhaps even laughed, your envy turned to rage. You seized the rolling pin, and in a moment of desperation, you struck her. Lydia's hands shook, her eyes darting to the others as if seeking an escape. Harold Finch leaned forward, his sharp features tense. "This is absurd," he interjected, his voice smooth but strained. "Lydia's no killer. You're spinning tales, Miss Marple." Tom Briar, his face pale, nodded faintly, while Ellen's tears flowed silently, her small frame trembling. Miss Marple's gaze remained on Lydia, her voice steady. "The notebook was your prize, wasn't it? You took it, hoping to find the source of the alkaloid, to claim Clara's success as your own. But in your panic, you lost it, didn't you?" Lydia's resolve crumbled, her shoulders slumping as sobs racked her thin frame. "I didn't mean to kill her," she gasped, her voice raw. "I went to talk, to make her admit she was cheating. She laughed at me, called me a jealous fool. I couldn't stand it, her smugness, her success. I grabbed the rolling pin just to scare her, but she turned away, and I hit her. It was over in a moment. I took the notebook, but I dropped it in the garden when I fled. I didn't know what to do." The room was silent, save for Lydia's sobs and the soft creak of Mrs. Clement's chair as she sank into it, stunned. Miss Marple's expression softened, but her mind was clear. "And Ellen," she said, turning to the maid. "You found Clara dead, the notebook open on the counter. You hid it to protect her name, didn't you?" Ellen nodded, her voice choked. "I couldn't let people think badly of her, miss. I took it to the vicarage garden, meaning to burn it, but I couldn't bring myself to do it." Miss Marple nodded, her eyes returning to Lydia. "The navy thread on the table. It was from your shawl, Mrs. Price, the one you wore at the fete. And the teacup, with your lipstick, was overlooked by Constable Reed in his haste. Small mistakes, but they tell the truth." Lydia's head bowed, her confession complete. Harold Finch's face was impassive, but his eyes betrayed a flicker of relief, as if a weight had lifted. Tom Briar looked dazed, his hands still clutching his tie, while Ellen's tears continued, her loyalty to Clara unshaken. Mrs. Clement, recovering her voice, called for Constable Reed, who arrived promptly, his notebook at the ready. Lydia, her defiance gone, went quietly, her sobs echoing as Reed led her away. The notebook, Ellen revealed, was hidden beneath a rosebush in the vicarage garden, and Reed retrieved it, a small, leather-bound volume, its pages filled with Clara's precise handwriting, including the name of her London supplier. Miss Marple declined to examine it, her work done. "The truth," she said to Mrs. Clement, "is better left to the proper authorities." As the guests dispersed, Miss Marple lingered, her knitting bag in hand. Harold Finch, pausing at the door, offered a curt nod. "You're a sharp one, Miss Marple. I underestimated this village." She smiled faintly, her eyes twinkling. "Villages, Mr. Finch, are full of surprises." Tom Briar, still shaken, mumbled his thanks, while Ellen, her face tear-streaked, whispered, "You understood, miss. Thank you." Miss Marple patted her hand, her kindness genuine, but her mind already turning to the fire waiting at home. Back at her cottage, Miss Marple sat by the hearth, her knitting resuming its familiar rhythm. The case was solved, the threads woven into a coherent whole. Lydia's envy, driven to violence, Ellen's loyalty, leading to her concealment, the alkaloid, the prize that sparked it all, the navy thread, the lipstick, the footprint, small clues. But in St. Mary Mead, small clues told the largest stories. "People are so predictable," she murmured, "yet their passions never cease to surprise." As the fire crackled, Miss Marple's thoughts drifted to Clara, whose baking had been her pride and her undoing. The notebook, now in Reed's hands, would reveal its secrets, but the village would heal, as it always did. She set her knitting aside, her mind at peace. "A recipe for murder," she said softly, "requires only a moment of weakness, but the truth, like good dough, always rises."